Well, today carry on in the book of Mark, and we're going to be sort of jumping all over the place today, and I hope it's justified because there's numbers of things we want to pick up on as we look at Mark's gospel and how it is that his story of Jesus' life describes to us not only just the simple linear story of Jesus' ministry, but a lot of the background story as well that goes on that describes to us the context, the social, the religious, and the political world that Jesus lived in, because it's all very influential in the way that he conducts his ministry. So today we're going to be starting off in Mark. We're going to end up in Exodus for a little while, just to prove the points of what I wanted to say, but you'll hopefully see why I do that. Well, last week, or 2 weeks ago, Albie spoke to us from this similar passage. And I'm just sort of dovetailing, if you like, from where Albie left off. Albie found himself describing what it means for the new followers of Jesus to how they came to grips with the Sabbath and how they came to grips with what Jesus' teaching was about the Sabbath. And particularly when Jesus said that, look, Sabbath was made for man, man wasn't made for the Sabbath. In other words, God didn't set up a whole bunch of laws and said, man, I love these laws. They are just so awesome. I've got to create some people to keep them. Does it make sense? Yeah, that makes sense? It does make sense, but it doesn't make sense, does it? And so Jesus is saying, look, God loves us, the people. And so because he loves us, he creates laws for us to live by so that we might live in fellowship with God, but also with one another. Okay, now you might, if you're a young fellow who's just been recently picked up for driving too fast, you might think that the law was there before you and it was created so it would catch you, but that's essentially the law is there to help us all live together. And so what Albie described to us is how this law started to override or overwhelm people in the day of Jesus. And so the law, rather than God himself, became an intimidating part of the religious worship. Now, we have all been subject to religious intolerance at some level, even in the life of any given church. I remember talking to a whole lot of young YWAMers, Youth with a Mission missionaries some years ago, and they were describing to me how in their context religion started to overwhelm or would overwhelm a relationship with God. And one lady particularly, one young lady probably in her early 20s, described to me how there was a lady in her church, she was from the States, United States, and she said she would stand there with her hand out in the foyer as all the young people came through for them to spit out their chewing gum before they went into church. Now, that's a real commitment, isn't it? I think, you get a handful of chewing gum, yeah? Handful of chewing gum. And so she was obviously committed to making sure that the chewing gum didn't end up in the bottom of the pew. But, we sort of, what level are we pushing it where the chewing gum becomes the priority of the day, the most important thing that you can do for Jesus? Well, Jesus in this passage that we're going to look at gets angry, okay? And we have to look at what he's getting angry about. But I thought I'd ask a few questions of ourselves about what makes us angry, because I think there's a tension or a difference between angry and frustrated, yeah? Some things we should, and understandably, get frustrated about. Other things we're allowed to get angry about. Now, here's a picture that has a number of questions about it. If this describes the gap between rich and poor, are you allowed to get angry about that? Is that fair to say? Yeah, I think we are. I think we're allowed to get angry about the distance between rich and poor. If it's a picture about a man wasting his life, he might have just simply been on drugs or something, you would say that's legitimate to get angry about that as well. Or if it's about the wealthy man's indifference towards somebody in need, there is a right also to be angry about that. What about a picture of poverty? People obviously in desperate need. Are we allowed to get angry about that? Yes? You guys are a little bit hard to warm up this morning, yes? Or are you a little bit unsure about that? What about a traffic jam? Frustrated or angry? Frustrated. Yeah. Frustrated. But then it leads to road rage, doesn't it? It spills over from frustration into road rage, and people get angry. Okay? What about frustrated or angry with this? Hey? Come on. Frustration, that's right. First world problem, isn't it? Hey? You like that saying, first world problem? I like that saying, first world problem. Okay, it's very easy to be frustrated when your cellular network closes down for the day. What about domestic violence? Angry. Yeah, we're getting there. What about if you were lining up to get a ticket for the final of the rugby last night? Okay? Sad. Okay? Frustrated. Okay? That's, angry. Yeah, there were some people who lined up all night and everybody on the internet beat them to all the tickets. That's almost enough to get angry, isn't it? And then, of course, if you were a Hurricane supporter, well, this is your picture too. Now, I've been spending quite a bit of time in Auckland over the last few years. Started to identify with Aucklanders. Their house prices have gone up 17% on average every year. Len decided to put their rates up. Does that make you frustrated or angry? Eh? Depends where you live, really, eh? If you're in Auckland, it's sort of like angry, frustrated. If you live in Tauranga, you say, good job. Okay. Okay, anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. I'm not trying to be political, probably am. Good old Len, eh? Yeah, every country's got a politician like him. Okay, what we're going to do now is start looking at this time in Jesus' ministry, very intense period of time, a very simple thing happening, and in many respects, he's doing what he does well. He's praying for people, he's healing the sick, and this is how it reads. Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he had healed him on the Sabbath. You get this? This is the Saturday, the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked him, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save or kill, save life or kill? But they remained silent. They looked around at him. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Now, it's easy just to read that and miss the drama of the story. But we can just imagine in the synagogue, okay, the Sabbath is a day of worship. Okay, so the place would have been full. Jesus is clearly doing some teaching here. He's been invited to respond to the teaching of the reading of the scrolls in that day. And the religious elite had come in. And they had this anticipation that Jesus is going to do something that will violate their religious laws. Now, religious laws are such that if you break them, you're in trouble with the religious leadership. Didn't necessarily mean you're in trouble with God, but the religious leadership didn't see it that way. If you're in trouble with the religious leadership, it was as good as being in trouble with God. So here's this guy with a shriveled hand. Jesus calls them out, and you could imagine the hushed tones that fall upon the place as the religious leaders are sort of leaning in. Is he going to do it? Is he going to heal somebody on the Sabbath? You see, the religious leaders had already concluded that to heal somebody was work, and you're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. In another of the Gospels, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus had already made the point very clear to the religious leaders that he wasn't interested in their Sabbath laws, because what he did is he had spat on the ground. Like the sound effects? Got the mud, put it onto somebody's eyes who was blind, and then caused his eyes to be healed. The problem that the religious leaders had was not that the man was healed, is that fact that he spat on the dirt. Because by spitting on the dirt made mud, and making mud was work. You love it? Okay? So they were angry with him about that. So here is Jesus teasing out the religion from them, teasing out the very thing that is driving him crazy and obviously becoming a huge burden upon the people. And so the suspense is there. And Jesus has this guy in front of him with a shriveled hand, and he says, what is right to do on the Sabbath? You imagine the pregnant pause there, that hush. Is it right to do evil, or is it right to do good? And no one said a word, which is what made Jesus angry. Because Jesus knew in his heart that their hearts were hardened to the idea that this man would benefit from Jesus' ministry on the Sabbath, the day that no work should occur. And that's why the scriptures tell us that Jesus was angry. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed that their stubborn hearts said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." Yeah? This is religion versus faith. This is religion versus faith. And the only time that we find Jesus getting angry is when religion gets in the way of a relationship with God. Yeah? Okay. And it's so easy for us to surround ourselves with religion. It's so easy to feel that my religion actually proves to God that I am pleasing him and that I'm making him happy. Yeah, friends of ours say that when they were raised, their mum had decided that it was okay to buy a loaf of bread on a Sunday, but we don't eat ice creams on a Sunday because that's fun. And God wouldn't want us to have fun on Sunday, would he? Would he? No fun on Sunday. No Sunday fun day. All right? All right. So here we've got this tension there, this problem. And Jesus took on their passive aggression. You notice how this was passive aggression. They weren't doing anything, but in their silence, they were doing everything by saying that it wasn't right to help somebody on the Sabbath. So defining Jesus' anger, firstly, we have to say that Jesus wasn't defending himself here. Anger is often about ourselves. Anger is a form of self-righteousness. I am right. I didn't have to do the dishes today. Okay, I am right. I'm defending that position. Okay, I did them last month for your interest, and I will defend the fact that it was a roasting dish that needed at least half an hour's attention. So I defend my right. It might be wrong, but it's right in your eyes. So Jesus wasn't defending anything here because he was defending the welfare or the rights of somebody else who was, in this case, a handicap with a shriveled hand. And so Jesus' anger wasn't defending himself, it was defending somebody else. And Jesus' anger was about others' selfishness. In other words, you there in the worship service with both hands held high in worship to God, wouldn't you much rather see your brother here with his healed hand held high to God to go out the following day and make a good living for himself because God has healed his hand? Or would you rather him stay in the condition that he is because it suits you with your religious laws to actually see him put in a spot where he stays because it's to your benefit, because somehow you think that God created laws for people to submit to, rather than God creating people and the laws help us live together? Does that make sense? Yeah. That's what made Jesus so angry. Now, you can pass up those things to me here. I've been thinking about this during the week and trying to work out how we can best describe this image of this relationship that we have with God. It's a little bit like this egg. You have to excuse, illustrations are never perfect, okay? Especially if I drop the egg, it's gone. I liken our relationship with God to the yolk and the white of an egg, okay? Two things melded together, okay? And the law encompasses that relationship, okay? Without the law, our relationship with God would have no definition. It would just eke out everywhere. We would never have any understanding of what is right, what is wrong, what pleases God, what doesn't please God. So the law wraps itself around our relationship with God and defines it. Without the eggshell, the yolk and the white would be undefined. Is that fair to say? Just go, yeah, okay. We can see that. It's pretty simple. The interesting thing, though, is that the egg shell itself is relatively fragile. Okay? So you just can't take the law of God and use it like it's in this sort of solid concrete case. The law itself is fragile, and it requires us as people with a relationship with God, serving God by keeping the law, to be gentle with one another. Does that make sense? Okay, because even though we have the law, and even though we know God, and even though we're trying to do it together, once somebody becomes a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more overpowering with somebody, telling you that I'm right and you're wrong, the whole thing starts to fall to pieces. But that's the way that God designed it. The law protects us, even though the law is fragile. Now, what has happened is that the religious leaders have gone and said, well, we're going to look after God and His people and His law, and we're going to create another set of safety barriers around the law and the people and God, all right? And this is called an extra layer of religion. God said to honor the Sabbath and to keep it holy. And then He described what you shouldn't do on the Sabbath. But what the religious leaders did is they said, we can protect you from breaking those laws by making a whole lot of laws that protect those laws from being broken. Yeah? Does that make sense? All right? So we put a box in there, and it means that we can now ensure that no one breaks the law and hurts the relationship that we have with God. But in doing so, what we've done is we've created a system which separates people from one another to keep them safe. Separates us from God because it stops us from getting too close. Does it make sense? Yeah. Okay, and so the very reason that Jesus was angry is because this box became more important than what's in the box. Yeah? This box became more important than what's in the box. And as time had gone on, in fact, what the religious leaders had done is they'd put another box around this and another box around that box, and they thought they were doing God a favor by doing that. Okay, I've used this illustration before in a different context describing the law of breaking the speed limit. If God said that the law was 100 kilometers on the open road, the religious leaders would say, let's just call it 70, shall we? Okay, God says 100, but we'll call it 70. As soon as you hit 71, we'll take your car off you. All right, and you're saying, but hold on, the law says 100. No, but we're protecting the law. And then some decades later, they'll say, well, that law of 70 was so good and it works so well, we need to protect that also. So what say we take your car off you when you hit 50? And you're saying, well, it's all very well to protect God, but life is rather sad and slow. Okay? Yes, but we're doing it for your benefit. Can't you see that? Well, all I'm doing now is steering at the speedo. I'm not enjoying the journey. Yeah? I'm steering at the speedo. There's no sense in which I can worship God because I'm more worried about the rules and the laws that I'm breaking. And you guys keep changing the rules and the laws to your benefit. And in fact, more to your benefit, you've created things that work for you. You know, the first time a trust. Anybody know what I mean by a trust? You have a family trust? The first time in Judaism that a trust was ever set up was to ensure that religious leaders could break the law without breaking the law. So in other words, they would say, I would normally give all my money to the poor, but I've set up a trust. And now that trust is dedicated to God. And only I, as a religious leader, can spend that money, and I don't choose to spend it on the poor because this money is God's money. Okay? It's called Korban, dedicated to God. Okay, you look up Korban, go to Google, Korban, Bible, you'll find it all defined there. Okay, it's not just a winery in North Auckland, all right? Okay, all right? Praise the Lord, eh? Yeah, praise the Lord. You see, the heart of man is so caught up with religion that it loses the idea that it's there for us to have a relationship with God. Okay, let's get back to our text. He looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Now, up until this point, as we've seen in Mark's Gospel, the religious leaders had just been observers. They'd just been in the background, just nonchalantly watching, observing, and then they move into a stage where they start to ask questions, but now they're coming quite rapidly to a conclusion that this guy Jesus isn't going to serve our purposes. A, he's breaking our laws, and B, he seems to be creating a popular uprising. And it's this popular uprising that is really getting them concerned. Let's read on from this statement here about the Pharisees and the Herodians wanting to kill Jesus. I'm going to come back and talk about the Herodians soon. But let's just capture what is going on now in and around Israel. Jesus withdrew with his disciples, this just follows on, to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan around Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Okay? So here's this group of people who want to kill him. Why do they want to kill him? Because he's popular. He's popular. And when somebody is popular, that sort of unbalances all the social and political framework that the society is built upon. You get a popular uprising, everybody who holds power, holds office, starts to get deeply disturbed. Just read the story of Martin Luther King Jr., and you'll see how social unrest causes people to do crazy things politically. Okay, but all of this is being said in the context of what is a summary in this time of Jesus' life, when Jesus sits back in the middle of this busyness and he decides whom it is that will be his closest disciples. It says, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter; James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder; Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, 12 men. And most of us know the stories about these men because we've read the story before. The reason why I've underlined Simon the Zealot is that Simon the Zealot was part of a rebellious political group. Okay, a number of decades before, there had been a revolt against Roman rule. The Romans were ruling Israel at the time, and there'd been a revolt. And it was called the Maccabean Uprising. After the Maccabean Uprising, when many of them were slaughtered, thousands of these rebels were slaughtered, another group developed called the Zealots. Now, we all know today what a zealot is: somebody who will lay their life down for the cause, somebody who will give it all up for the sake of the purpose they want to achieve. And Simon was a zealot, which makes it intriguing because when you look at the group of disciples that Jesus had, he had within that group Matthew the tax collector, who collected taxes for Rome. All right? The very people that the zealots hate. So when Jesus pulls this team together, there's internal problems there that unless Jesus sorts out, 12 disciples will quickly become 11, and the guy who did the killing would have to be ejected too. So the first meeting was going to be rather interesting, to say the least. But that tells you a little bit about the nature of Jesus. The second group that were political and active were the Pharisees. And we see a lot of the Pharisees, particularly towards the end of Jesus' life, when they are the ones who instigate with Rome his death and his trial and crucifixion. But the other group is very rarely mentioned, of this group that was mentioned earlier on, called the Herodians. You notice that after the man's hand was healed, the man with the shriveled hands was healed, it said that the Pharisees and the Herodians went out of the synagogue and decided to plot to kill Jesus. Now, this was a group which you will find in any society. Having been overwhelmed by Rome, This group are usually wealthy, and it doesn't take them long to cozy up to the political or military elite, to cozy up. And when they cozy up, they are prepared to compromise the things that they believed in, the things that they had going on before, to ensure that they stay in a position of wealth or privilege or responsibility. And in this case, the Herodians, by their definition, were pro-Herod, and they were aiming towards a political takeover which would see Herod rule, maybe establish his own kingship in that area in a way that would overrule all the religious leadership and subdue the zealots. Okay? So these people, the Herodians, were people of compromise. Later on in Mark's gospel, Jesus said this, "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." The yeast of Herod. Now, he wasn't talking about Herod himself. He was talking about the yeast of Herod being found in the group called the Herodians. In other words, the yeast that would get in and permeate and change and cause people to compromise. Now, the thing about yeast, as most of you will know, is that yeast, you only need a tiny little bit in a dough of bread to cause the bread to rise. If there's no yeast, it's a flat bread, like a naan bread or something along those lines. But yeast is found in most of our bread, but you only need a tiny little piece of it. And this is where Jesus points out that there is compromise going on in these people here. So when Jesus is defining who will be his 12, he has already worked out who is not going to be in his 12. Does that make sense? If I am selecting a sports team, I would have a pretty clear idea who I wouldn't have in that team versus whom I will have. So once you eliminate who you won't have, it makes it easier to work out who you will have. It's an obvious thing to say, isn't it? But Jesus had already determined that he's not going to have these people who will win this battle by the sword, the zealots. He won't take those who are hard-hearted Pharisees who are more interested in defending their own laws than God's law. And he certainly won't take a group of people who are prepared to compromise their faith. All right? So, what I want to do now is just highlight how easy that is to allow the yeast to come in. Look, socially today in New Zealand, we live in changing times, don't we? Spent a little bit of time down in Parliament in recent years, and one of the big things on the government agenda has been social housing. Remember, they're worried about the Australians coming in and taking over our state housing stocks and using them to building a business to make money. Well, over the last 3 years, churches have been in big discussions with the government about how they might take over this housing stock. And the Salvation Army had very, very intense conversations with the government about this opportunity that was being given them to buy up state houses and then become the landlord for the disadvantaged in our society. The interesting thing is that during those discussions, the Salvation Army had to tell the government, stop quoting the fact that we are in discussion with you. Stop telling the newspaper that we're in discussion with you. The reason being is that by the time the media boys put their spin on it, it sounded like the Salvation Army were 100% behind the government selling these stocks, couldn't wait to get their hands on them, and life was going to be so much better once this all happened. That was all government spin. But it made it look like the Salvation Army had compromised and were now aligning themselves politically with the national government. As churches, we have to be so careful that we don't seem to be citing and being quoted in ways that look like we're compromising what we stand for and what we believe. The simple truth of it is the last thing at the end of the day that the Salvation Army needed to be was a landlord. Because what does the Salvation Army then have to do when someone doesn't pay their rent? They have to kick somebody out. That is not good for the Salvation Army's reputation. Okay, I'm not saying they're not scared of hard work, but they couldn't do that. More recently, of course, there's been the passing of the law for same-sex marriage. It's very easy within church life just to say, hey, wherever the government goes, we'll go. And sadly, some churches have already conceded that. We're just happy to go wherever you go. If we think that 2 men or 2 women are okay to marry, well, we'll do that within our churches. And so that's not a biblical definition of marriage. And so we have to then stand and say, look, we'll go this far, but we're not going to go that far, thanks very much. And so it's a real political hot potato. But it's always a sense in which compromise creeps in. I want to take us back to the days of Moses, just to give you some examples as we round out this talk, of how compromise can so easily get into our life if we're tempted to. And Moses was sent by God to Egypt to talk to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said, Moses said, "Let my people go." Pharaoh said, "No." Okay, this is Craig's condensed version of the story. You'll understand why it's condensed, because it takes chapters to tell. However, in the negotiations, there were compromises that were offered by Pharaoh to Moses. Moses said, "Let my people go. I want all the men, women, and children, everything they own, to be released from this land of bondage. You've had them for 400 years working as slaves. Enough is enough. Let them go." Moses wanted this. Pharaoh didn't want this. So in Exodus 8:1, it says, "Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, 'Go sacrifice to your God here in the land.'" Here's a compromise. You don't have to go. If you want to worship your God, I'll let you have a couple of days off work. You can wander down the road, somewhere where you're not being beaten up as slaves, and you can have a church service. And what did Moses say? He said, "No way, no thanks. We're not doing that. That's not what we are here for. We're here to go completely." And so in this context, God caused plagues to come upon Egypt. Okay, so a couple of plagues came upon Egypt, and then after a little while, Pharaoh says, "These guys are pretty stubborn." So he takes Moses to one side. Pharaoh said, "The Lord be with you." Notice how he's getting religious on Moses now. "Lord be with you. If I let you go along with your women and children, clearly you are bent on evil." So he's saying, "I'm going to let you go here, but I know that you're actually up to no good. But I'm not going to let you go with your women and children." I messed this up. I should have another verse in there. He actually invited Moses to go just with the men. "I'll let you go outside of Egypt, just the men alone." Okay? And Moses said, "No, we have to take the whole family. We're all going." And it's very easy in our religious system just to, as parents, say, "Look, as a family, we'll define our Christianity by mum and dad doing this. We'll do the Christian thing, and you kids can work it out for yourselves later on. But as for you and I, mum and dad, this is what we will do." Okay? But for Moses, he was invited just to go outside the camp, just take the men. And Moses came back and said, "No, we all go." And then thirdly, Pharaoh summoned Moses and he said, "Go worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go with you, only leave your flocks and herds behind." See how this is an evolving story? But Moses said, "You must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to the Lord our God." And again, a very easy compromise is to say, "God, you can have my wife and my family. You can have my kids, but you can't have my money. You can't have my car. You can't have my property. You can't have my business." Moses said to Pharaoh, when he was given the opportunity just to go and to take the family, he says, "No, we go because everything that we have is part of our identity. Everything that we own is also part of our worship." And reason why I've raised this is because the seed of the Herodians, the seed of compromise was found right even there in the book of Exodus, in the very earliest days of Moses forming a people. The temptation is always one to compromise your faith, to get cozy and cuddly with the religious elite, to get cozy and cuddly with the politically powerful, to get close and cuddly with the socially superior. Because that is where the temptations come from. How it is that we roll over and get all excited about some person who has seemingly more authority, power, or persuasion than us. And we get comfortable with them, and next thing we know, we are compromising what it is that we believe. You know, everybody in the Christian community at the moment is getting all excited because Justin Bieber is going to Hillsong in Sydney. Did anybody read about that? Okay. You didn't read about that? You're just reading the wrong magazines, darling. Hey? You're just reading the wrong. Jim would have known about that. He's onto it. Hey? Yes, no, it was all aflame in the social pages on the internet. And he's going there with his girlfriend. And so I wonder if anybody's asked them, you know, it's all very well to go there with your girlfriend, Justin, but whereabouts are you staying? You know, what's this Christian thing really all about? Are you going just to keep up appearances? Are you going to release a new Christian album to try to tap into that market? Forgive my cynicism. Forgive my cynicism. But you see, compromise is so, you know, God bless Justin Bieber. Maybe he's had a road to Damascus experience. I hope he has. But it is so easy for us, even as Christians, to bow down to some movement that looks like it's on the road to God. You know, this is the thing that Herod did. Herod built the temple for the Jews. He spent an enormous amount of wealth. And the religious leaders, the Herodians and the Pharisees of the day said, yep, we'll take your money. We'll take your money because it'll make us look good and we'll be chummy, close and cozy with you. When we go back and we look at whom it is that Jesus chose, let's remind ourselves of the simplicity and the integrity and the honesty of the men that he took. And when he even chose to take somebody who would betray him, Jesus knew fully who it would be even from the outset. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Jesus got angry. Jesus got angry. But he got angry at compromise. He got angry at the little bits of yeast that got into the dough. He got angry because people were prepared to just slip and slide and compromise their way through their religious life and to ensure that religion had the final say. And once religion has the final say, we're not really worshipping, and perhaps I shouldn't say this, we just end up like a bunch of eggs. Eh? Just a bunch of eggs. Left to ourselves, we'll go smelly, okay, fragile, easy to crack, and in this case, compromised. Let's stand and pray. Indeed, Lord, we don't have to be that discerning to realize that we find ourselves in those categories of zealots, Pharisees, or Herodians, where the yeast has come in and caused compromise. Indeed, maybe even as soon as the end of the day or as close as yesterday, we've fallen into that trap. And we're so mindful, Lord, that you don't come to condemn us, to remove us from that compromise, but you come to woo us with your great love and power, with the attractive qualities of a better way, and what that means for us to live even in today's changing and politically crazy environment. Father, we know that things weren't different 2,000 years ago. People were people, and yeast was still active. And we come before you today, Lord, and we need to surrender that area of compromise that we've caused ourselves to be captured by or even intimidated by, that has given ourselves freedom, if you like, to walk outside of your will. Well, that's a tough call for us because There's so many rules and laws that we can call upon and so many justifications we can have for why we do what we do. But we look at the 12. We look at the 12 and we look at the simplicity of their zeal and the desire that they had to follow you. And we love to just see ourselves in that category and not in those who are plotting and planning to destroy you. So Lord, give us the strength to make good decisions. Decisions to keep the yeast away. Decisions not to get cozy with the political, the wealthy, the socially superior, as the world may see it. But indeed to align ourselves with you and your will and the purpose of your kingdom. We ask this so that Jesus will be glorified through our lives. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.